1 month after my sister's wedding, the photographer called me and said, "Ma'am, I noticed something terrible. Come immediately, and do not say anything to your sister." What he showed me changed everything. My name is Valerie, and I am 34 years old. I work as a senior wealth manager and forensic auditor in Washington, D.C. My daily life revolves around tracking millions of dollars, finding hidden assets, and exposing financial fraud. Yet the biggest fraud of all was happening right inside my own family. The suffocating red glow of Desmond's darkroom felt like the perfect setting for a nightmare. The heavy scent of developer fluid in the studio grounded me in reality. There were no lengthy introductions or small talk when I arrived. Desmond simply pointed a trembling finger at a high-resolution digital blow-up on his main monitor. It was a candid shot taken from the balcony of the bridal suite on the morning of my sister's wedding. In the center of the frame was Preston, my new white brother-in-law, gripping the waist of Kendras' maid of honor. His hands were placed far lower than any married man should ever place them on another woman. But that was not the detail that made the blood freeze in my veins. My eyes moved past the illicit embrace to the glass table right beside them. Resting clearly in the morning light was the original deed to my grandmother's $4 million historic brownstone. It was a property that had been in our family for generations, a piece of prime real estate that I was solely responsible for managing. And right there at the bottom of the page was a signature that looked suspiciously like mine. But I had never signed that paper. My mind flashed back to the morning of the wedding 1 month ago. The memory was not a distant thought, but a visceral reality. I remembered standing in that very same bridal suite while my mother Vivian shoved a cheap polyester bridesmaid dress against my chest. Her eyes were hard and unyielding as she delivered her orders. She told me that Preston was a Montgomery. She said his family built this city and that I needed to fix my face. She demanded that I pay the $20,000 floral bill because his elite bank had supposedly flagged his card for a security check. I stood there holding the ugly dress while she told me to just pay the bill and let my sister shine. Let your sister shine. That phrase was the soundtrack of my entire life. It was a rhythmic reminder of 3 decades of financial and emotional extortion. Let your sister shine when I paid for her out-of-state college tuition because our parents had spent the college fund on luxury cars. Let your sister shine when I bought her a condo deposit so she could pretend to be independent. Let your sister shine when I stayed in the background while they paraded her around the local elite social circles. I was always the bitter spinster in their eyes, the dry accountant who only existed to fund their delusions of grandeur. They worshipped the idea of being part of the black elite, desperate for validation from groups that cared only about pedigree and wealth. Preston was their golden ticket. He was the white man from an old money family who would finally elevate them to the status they craved. Or so they thought. The brownstone was more than just a building. It was a symbol of my grandmother's hard work during an era when black women could barely open bank accounts. She had scrubbed floors and saved every penny to buy that property in a neighborhood that was now experiencing massive gentrification. She left it in my care because she knew I was the only one who respected its history. My mother, Vivian, and my father, Marcus, had always viewed the property as a giant cash machine just waiting to be cracked open. They resented that my grandmother had bypassed them, knowing they would have sold it for a quick profit to buy country club memberships and designer clothes. At the wedding, the $20,000 floral bill was just the tip of the iceberg. Vivian had literally cornered me in the hallway, while the florist threatened to pack up the imported orchids. She snatched my credit card from my purse herself. She told me that Kendra could not suffer the humiliation of an empty reception hall. She insisted that Preston would wire me the money by Monday morning. Of course, Monday came and went, and Preston suddenly claimed his trust fund distribution was temporarily locked due to an international tax audit. I ended up absorbing the cost, just like I absorbed every other financial disaster this family created. Looking at the monitor in Desmond's studio, I felt no urge to cry. I was not a fragile victim waiting to be saved. I was a forensic auditor who destroyed white-collar criminals for a living. I pulled out my phone and dialed the District of Columbia Registrar of Deeds on speakerphone. The clerk on the other end of the line pulled up the property file while Desmond watched in stunned silence. The clerk confirmed my worst suspicions in a matter of seconds. The historic brownstone had been mortgaged 3 days ago for a $2 million black market loan. The deed transfer had been notarized and rushed through the system. My signature was perfectly forged. I thanked the clerk, ended the call, and put my phone back into my designer bag. The sheer audacity of the crime was almost impressive. They had stolen $2 million using my inheritance and left the evidence in a wedding photo. I turned to look at Desmond, who was sweating under the red lights. I told him to prep the digital files and print high-definition hard copies of everything. Sunday brunch at my parents' house was about to get very interesting. The drive to my parents' house in my sleek black sedan felt entirely different from my usual Sunday visits. Normally, I dreaded the weekly brunch, knowing it would be a parade of passive-aggressive comments about my single status and my boring career. But today, the anticipation was intoxicating. My phone chimed through the car audio system, playing a voicemail from my mother, Vivian. Her voice echoed through the speakers, laced with that familiar tone of superiority that always made my teeth grind. She told me to make sure I brought the expensive imported champagne from that specialty wine shop downtown. She explicitly stated that Preston only drinks the best, and that I needed to stop being so cheap when it came to celebrating my new brother-in-law. She reminded me to park my car on the street so Preston's imported sports car could have the main driveway. The sheer disrespect was a daily occurrence, a constant drip of poison that I had learned to ignore. But today, the poison was fuel. I listened to the message twice, letting her entitlement focus my mind. I had not brought the champagne. I had brought a thick manila envelope filled with high-resolution photographs and legal documents. I pulled into the driveway of their pristine suburban home. The house was a monument to their desperate need to appear wealthy. The lawn was manicured to an unnatural perfection, and the driveway was filled with leased luxury cars they could barely afford. Walking up the path, I noticed the newly planted rose bushes, undoubtedly charged to one of the many credit cards they had maxed out to maintain this charade. The heavy mahogany door swung open before I could even turn the brass handle. I walked into the grand foyer. The living room was a scene of manufactured upper-class bliss. Portraits of my parents and my sister hung everywhere, while photos of me were noticeably absent. Kendra was sitting on the velvet sofa, showing off a brand-new bright orange luxury bag to our parents. She was boasting about how Preston had a personal shopper source it directly from Paris. Preston was standing by the wet bar, acting like the lord of the manor. He was wearing a tailored linen suit, swirling a mimosa in a crystal glass, and loudly lecturing my father Marcus about the finer points of investing in commercial real estate. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a mediocre man who knew his audience was desperate for his approval. My parents were hanging on his every word, nodding enthusiastically, as if he were granting them the secrets to the universe. When I walked into the room, the conversation abruptly stopped. Vivian looked at my empty hands, her face instantly contorting into a scowl. She demanded to know where the champagne was, loudly complaining that I could never follow simple instructions and that I was purposely trying to ruin a beautiful morning. I did not answer her. I walked straight past my mother, past my sister clutching her bag paid for with stolen money, and approached the brunch spread that had been laid out on the massive dining table. I pulled a cheap bottle of sparkling cider from my bag and dropped it directly into the trash can next to the buffet. Then I opened the manila envelope. With a swift, practiced motion, I slapped the printed photos and the forged mortgage inquiry directly onto the table, right over the platter of imported smoked salmon. I looked dead into Preston's eyes and asked him to explain why his hands were all over my sister's best friend, and more importantly, why my forged signature was sitting on a table in his bridal suite. The silence in the room was absolute. Kendra dropped her designer bag on the floor and rushed to the table. She stared at the high-definition photo of her new husband holding her best friend in a highly inappropriate embrace. She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, but her eyes quickly darted to the second document I had thrown down. The official record from the city showing a $2 million black market loan taken out against the brownstone. Vivian and Marcus crowded around the table, their eyes scanning the undeniable proof of fraud. I waited for the explosion. I waited for my father to grab Preston by the collar and throw him out of the house. I waited for my mother to scream at the man who had just betrayed her precious golden child. But the explosion did not happen the way I expected. Instead of outrage directed at the thief standing in their living room, Marcus slowly stood up straight. His face hardened, but his anger was not aimed at Preston. He turned and glared directly at me. He slammed his fist down on the dining table, rattling the crystal glasses. He looked me in the eye and proudly admitted that he was the one who signed my name on that deed. I stared at him, trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. My own father had forged my signature to steal my grandmother's legacy. Marcus did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He raised his voice, shouting that he signed it for me because I was too stubborn to see the big picture. He declared that Preston needed seed money for a massive new investment fund that was going to make the family rich. He pointed a finger at my chest and yelled that I was a single woman who worked too much, that I had no husband, no children, and absolutely no need for a $4 million historic house. He actually said that it was my duty as the older sister to provide the capital so Preston could elevate the family name. Vivian immediately stepped up beside him, nodding in furious agreement. She told me to stop causing drama over a simple business transaction, completely ignoring the fact that her son-in-law was cheating on her daughter in the very photos lying on the table. They had chosen the illusion of wealth over their own flesh and blood. I stood perfectly still, letting the sheer absurdity of their logic wash over me. My father had committed a serious felony. He had conspired with a grifter to bypass the legal trust my grandmother had explicitly set up to protect the property from his exact kind of financial recklessness. He spoke about seed money and investment funds as if he were a mogul completely blind to the fact that he was the mark in a classic con game. Vivian crossed her arms and told me that I was acting selfishly. She insisted that Preston was doing us a favor by taking the property off my hands and managing the assets like a real man should. She said that once the new investment fund paid out, they would give me back my original share, minus a management fee for Preston's hard work. I looked at Kendra, expecting her to be devastated by the visual proof of her husband's infidelity. Instead, she pushed the photo of Preston and the maid of honor aside, acting as if it were a minor inconvenience. She looked at me with pure disdain and told me that I was just a jealous, bitter woman trying to ruin her marriage because I could not find a man of my own. She claimed the photo was probably just a drunken mistake or taken out of context. The delusion was so thick it was suffocating. They were all so deeply invested in the lie of Preston that they were willing to sacrifice my livelihood, my grandmother's legacy, and even basic marital respect to keep the fantasy alive. This was no longer just a family dispute over favoritism. This was a coordinated criminal conspiracy, and my own parents were the willing accomplices. My father, Marcus, stood there with his chest puffed out like a proud patriarch who had just made the business deal of the century. He had just confessed to a federal crime, forging my signature to steal my inheritance, and yet he expected me to apologize to him. I looked from the high-definition photograph of Preston gripping the bridesmaid to the fraudulent deed transfer lying right next to the quiche. Before I could ask Marcus if he actually understood the legal definition of wire fraud, my mother Vivian stepped firmly between us. She smoothed down her designer silk blouse and glared at me with that familiar mixture of embarrassment and rage. She did not look at the photograph showing her new son-in-law committing adultery. She did not look at the black market loan documents that put our family legacy in jeopardy. She only looked at me, her disappointment radiating through the room. She told me to lower my voice and stop acting like a jealous child. She said I was trying to ruin a perfectly beautiful Sunday brunch because I could not stand to see my sister happy. I asked her if she was blind. I pointed to the photo and told her that her precious new son-in-law was violating her daughter's best friend on her wedding day. Vivian barely glanced at the glossy print. She waved her hand dismissively and said, "Men in power make mistakes, and that women of our stature need to understand the bigger picture." The bigger picture, according to Vivian, was access. She stepped closer to Preston, placing a protective hand on his tailored linen shoulder. She looked at me with pure condescension and declared that Preston was old money. She said his ancestors came over on the Mayflower and that the Montgomery name held weight in rooms where our money meant absolutely nothing. She reminded me that we had been trying to get off the wait list for the exclusive Oak Creek Country Club for 7 years. They had rejected Marcus 3 times, despite his successful dental practice. Vivian proudly announced that Preston had promised to sponsor their membership. "He is elevating this family," she said, her voice rising with manic conviction. "You need to understand your place, Valerie. He is elevating this family." The repetition of that phrase made my stomach turn. He is elevating this family. She said it like a prayer, a desperate chant, to ward off the reality sitting right in front of her. She was perfectly willing to sacrifice my $4 million brownstone, my grandmother's sweat and blood, just to sit at a table with people who would never view her as an equal. She wanted the elite social circles, the charity galas, and the prestigious boards. Kendra finally moved from the sofa. She picked up the photograph of Preston and her maid of honor, studying it for exactly 2 seconds before tossing it back onto the table. She laughed, a sharp and brittle sound that echoed in the dining room. She told me it was just a drunken mistake at a wedding reception. She claimed her best friend had already apologized for having too much tequila and tripping into Preston's arms. Kendra crossed her arms and looked me up and down with complete disgust. She said I was just a bitter, loveless spinster who spent her weekends crunching numbers because no man would ever want to deal with my terrible attitude. She boasted that she was now a Montgomery, a name that would open doors for her in the political circles of Washington, and that I was just a sad accountant trying to drag everyone down to my miserable level. She bragged about her future life in high society, convinced her husband was her absolute golden ticket to a life of untouchable privilege and endless wealth. Preston set his crystal mimosa, glass down on the counter. The charming, polite facade he had maintained for the past year completely vanished. He walked slowly toward me, using his height to try and intimidate me. He stood uncomfortably close, invading my personal space in a way he never would have dared if we were in a public setting. He leaned his head down, keeping his voice to a menacing whisper so Vivian and Marcus could not hear the venom in his tone. He told me that I was playing a dangerous game. He reminded me of his race and his family lineage, stating that people like him always win against people like me. He threatened to make one phone call to his uncle, a federal judge, and have my certified public accountant license stripped by the end of the week. He said his family had enough political connections to ensure I would never work in the financial sector again. He promised to completely destroy my career, drain my bank accounts in frivolous legal battles, and leave me begging on the streets if I ever tried to challenge him or the deed transfer again. He smiled, a nasty, arrogant smile, fully believing that his white privilege and fake lineage made him invincible in this house. As Preston leaned back, a single drop of his mimosa dripped from his glass onto my wrist. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the emotional breakdown they were desperately waiting to use against me. I pulled a handkerchief from my bag and wiped the liquid from my skin. I looked Preston dead in the eyes, stripping away every ounce of power he thought he held in that room. I told him that he was indeed a Montgomery, but then I asked him to tell me something else. I lowered my voice to match his menacing tone, ensuring every word cut straight through his arrogant facade. "You are a Montgomery. But tell me, do the Montgomerys know you are using a dead man's social security number to secure underground loans?" I walked out of the heavy front doors and got into my car. I did not shed a single tear on the drive downtown. Tears were a luxury for people who had a safety net. I had balance sheets. I drove perfectly. My mind was already cataloging the variables, calculating the exact trajectory of the financial bomb Preston had just detonated in my family. I drove to my office. The glass doors slid open to reveal the humming nervous system of my firm. I walked past rows of junior analysts and standard accountants, the quiet clicking of keyboards stopping for a fraction of a second as I passed. My family loved to tell their country club friends that I was just a basic bookkeeper who filed tax returns for local businesses. For years, I had allowed them to minimize my life to protect their delicate egos. They had no idea. I commanded an elite division of forensic auditors specializing in high net worth asset recovery. My senior analyst, a brilliant young woman named Denise, immediately stood up from her desk when she saw my face. She handed me a fresh coffee and tablet without me asking. I told Denise to initiate a priority trace on a newly registered mortgage lien against my grandmother's historic property. I instructed my team to drop everything and pull every public record shadow network transaction and offshore wire transfer associated with Preston Montgomery III. Within 10 minutes, I was sitting behind the massive desk in my corner office. The panoramic views of the Capitol building outside were completely ignored as I watched my monitors light up with incoming data. I did not operate on emotion. I operated on cold, hard, relentless mathematics. The numbers never lied, and they were about to tell me exactly how my father and my brother-in-law had managed to orchestrate a $2 million fraud right under my nose. Denise walked in holding a thick stack of printed transaction logs. She locked the door behind her and spread the papers across my desk. I scrutinized the digital paper trail with predatory precision. The mechanics of the crime were almost insulting in their simplicity. My father had leveraged his dental practice credentials and his pristine credit score to co-sign the black market loan, deliberately bypassing standard banking regulations and background checks. But the real story was where the money went after it cleared the initial escrow account. My mother, Vivian, and my father, Marcus, genuinely believed Preston was using these funds to launch a prestigious venture capital firm. They thought this imaginary business would finally elevate our family name into the untouchable upper echelons of elite society. The routing numbers told a completely different and far more pathetic story. Preston had not invested a single dime into any legitimate business entity. I traced the first block of $500,000 as it bounced through a digital laundering service before being wired directly to an offshore casino holding company based in Macau. He was not an investor. He was a degenerate gambler scrambling to cover massive underground debts. The next sequence of wire transfers was even more sickening. $1.2 million was funneled through a newly formed shell corporation. I pulled the registration documents for that specific shell company and found the address. The money was used to purchase a luxury penthouse apartment in Arlington, Virginia. I cross-referenced the property deed and found it was registered under the exact name of Kendras' maid of honor. Preston was using my grandmother's historic brownstone, the house she had scrubbed floors to afford to finance his crippling gambling addiction and buy a multi-million-dollar love nest for his mistress. He was treating our generational wealth like his personal piggy bank. The remaining funds were being rapidly drained through daily maximum cash withdrawals, expensive imported champagne deliveries, and luxury car leases. It was a classic sloppy con job executed by a man who thought his white privilege made him invisible to consequences. Preston was not an old money savior arriving to lift my family to greatness. He was a desperate parasite, bleeding my family dry, and my own parents were happily handing him the knife just for the privilege of standing next to him. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, taking a slow sip of my coffee. The sheer audacity of their betrayal washed over me, leaving nothing but a clinical determination to destroy him. The time for playing the compliant older sister was officially over. I had everything I needed to put Preston in federal prison and strip my parents of their delusional pride. I picked up my desk phone, preparing to authorize Denise to draft the foreclosure notice and the official federal fraud report. Before my finger could even press the button, a massive commotion erupted in the outer lobby. The heavy double doors of the executive suite violently burst open, shattering the quiet professional focus of the entire floor. Vivian and Marcus stormed past the reception desk, screaming at the top of their lungs. The sheer volume of their screaming caused several partners to step out of their offices in alarm. They were banking on my embarrassment, hoping I would surrender just to quiet them down. My mother shoved past Jackson, the security guard, pointing a trembling finger directly at my glass office walls. She shouted for everyone to hear that I was a thief, a liar, and a manipulator. She loudly announced to my entire staff of elite auditors that I was committing severe elder financial abuse, attempting to steal her retirement funds, and maliciously destroying my own family out of pure bitter spite. My father marched right behind her, demanding to see my superiors immediately. They had come to publicly humiliate me in the very center of my professional stronghold, aiming to get me fired, ruin my reputation, and completely destroy my career before I could expose their precious golden boy. Vivian stood in the center of the trading floor, waving her arms like a woman possessed. She pointed her manicured finger at my glass office and screamed that I was a criminal. She wailed to the entire room of senior analysts that I was embezzling money from our family trust to fund my lavish lifestyle. She claimed my designer suits and my luxury sedan were paid for with stolen money. Marcus stood right beside her, puffing out his chest and demanding to speak to the managing partner immediately. He yelled that his daughter was a jealous, bitter woman, using federal corporate resources to illegally harass his wealthy new son-in-law. They wanted a public execution. They wanted my colleagues to see me as a fraud, so I would be stripped of my credentials and thrown out into the street before I could expose their golden boy. I did not stand up. I did not rush out to shush them or beg them to be quiet. I remained seated behind my custom mahogany desk, simply watching them perform their pathetic circus act through the soundproof glass. The entire floor had gone completely silent. Analysts paused their typing. Junior accountants stared in disbelief. My parents mistook that silence for agreement. They thought they were winning. Vivian began crying fake tears, sobbing about how she had sacrificed everything to raise me only for me to turn into a monster who wanted to destroy her sister's beautiful high society marriage. She yelled that I was forging documents to make Preston look like a criminal because no man would ever want me. Then the heavy double doors of the executive corner suite opened. Jacqueline stepped out. Jacqueline was the managing partner of our firm, a formidable black woman who had built her empire by destroying corrupt billionaires in federal court. She wore a tailored crimson suit that commanded instant respect, and her expression was absolutely lethal. She did not rush. She walked across the trading floor with the slow, deliberate pace of a predator. The click of her heels against the polished marble floor echoed through the dead silent room. Vivian saw her coming and immediately tried to play the devastated matriarch. She rushed toward Jacqueline, clasping her hands together and crying about how she needed to report a rogue employee. Vivian spewed her lies, claiming that I was using company software to steal from my own parents and that I needed to be escorted out by the police immediately. Marcus nodded vigorously, adding that I was a liability to their prestigious firm and that Preston Montgomery III would personally sue them if they did not fire me. Jacqueline did not entertain the chaos. She stopped 2 feet away from my mother and raised one single hand. The gesture was so commanding that Vivian's mouth snapped shut instantly. Jacqueline looked my parents up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She took a moment to stare at Vivian's obviously counterfeit designer scarf. She spoke in a voice that was quiet, but carried the sharp crack of a whip. She informed my parents that she was the managing partner of this firm and that absolutely nothing happened on this floor without her explicit authorization. Jacqueline looked directly at my mother and dismantled her entire existence in just a few sentences. She stated that she personally signed off on every internal audit involving employee assets to ensure absolute federal compliance. She told Vivian that she knew exactly where my money went, because 5 years ago she had personally verified the wire transfers when I liquidated my own early stock options. Vivian looked confused for a fraction of a second before Jacqueline dropped the bomb. Jacqueline announced to the entire floor that I had drained $80,000 of my own savings to pay off Kendras' Howard University tuition in full. Jacqueline exposed the fact that Marcus and Vivian had completely defaulted on their parent loans and were on the verge of facing severe collections. She stated loud and clear that I was not stealing from the family, but that I had been the sole financial crutch, keeping them from total bankruptcy for the last decade. She even mentioned that I was the one paying Kendras' sorority dues so they could maintain their precious upper-class facade. The collective gasp from my colleagues was highly audible. The illusion of my parents' old money wealth shattered right there in the middle of Washington, D.C.'s top financial district. My mother turned the color of wet ash. Her carefully constructed facade of being a wealthy society matriarch was completely annihilated. Marcus took a step back, looking around the room as dozens of elite financial experts stared at him with pure contempt. He tried to stammer out a denial, claiming it was a misunderstanding, but his voice cracked horribly. They had walked into a fortress of forensic accountants trying to lie about money. It was the most foolish mistake they could have possibly made. Jacqueline did not give them a chance to recover. She snapped her fingers and pointed at Jackson, our head of security, who was already standing by the elevators. She ordered Jackson to escort the trespassers off her floor immediately. She added that if they ever showed their faces in this building again, she would personally have them arrested for trespassing and file a civil suit for corporate disruption. Vivian tried to scream my name, demanding that I come out of my office and defend them. She shrieked that family was supposed to stick together. Jackson grabbed Marcus by the arm, while another guard flanked Vivian. They were physically dragged toward the elevators, fighting and kicking like common criminals. The heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off my mother's frantic screaming. The trading floor remained silent for 3 seconds. Before Jacqueline turned around and gave a single nod, everyone immediately went back to work, the sound of typing resuming like a heavy rain. Jacqueline walked straight into my office and closed the glass door behind her. She hit a button on the wall, instantly dropping the privacy blinds and sealing us off from the rest of the floor. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not offer me a tissue or a sympathetic hug. She knew I was a shark, and she treated me like one. She walked up to my desk and reached into the pocket of her crimson blazer. She slid a heavy matte black encrypted flash drive across the polished wood of my desk. It stopped right next to my keyboard. I looked up at her, meeting her intense gaze. Jacqueline leaned forward, placing both hands flat on my desk. Her eyes were burning with a fierce, protective fire that told me everything I needed to know. She had utilized her own elite network of federal contacts while my parents were throwing their tantrum outside. She looked at me and delivered her final instruction with absolute deadly precision. Take the gloves off. Find out exactly who this Preston Montgomery III really is. I stared at the matte black drive resting on my desk for exactly 3 seconds before plugging it into my secure terminal. Jacqueline did not hand out her personal encryption keys lightly. Entering my secondary authentication protocols, I watched a loading bar slice across my dual monitors. The firm had access to Tier 1 federal databases, private wealth registries, and sealed court dockets. I was bypassing standard civilian background checks and digging straight into the digital skeleton of Preston Montgomery III. The screen flickered green and rows of classified documents cascaded down my monitors. I cracked my knuckles and began reading. The old money illusion that my parents worshipped shattered before I even reached the second page of his file. Preston was indeed a Montgomery by blood, but he was entirely cut off from the family fortune. 5 years ago, he had orchestrated a massive Ponzi scheme, specifically targeting the retirement funds of elderly widows in his own elite social circle. He never saw the inside of a federal prison cell because his grandfather swooped in and quietly paid full restitution to the victims. But that bailout came with a severe ironclad condition. The Montgomery family officially disowned him, legally severed him from all trusts, and permanently exiled him from their elite society. Preston was essentially a ghost wearing a tailored suit and a stolen legacy. He owned absolutely nothing of value in his own name. Everything he touched was a highly calculated lie designed to extract wealth from unsuspecting victims. I cross-referenced his banking history with his recent social media footprints, piecing together the exact mechanics of his grift. Stripped of his trust fund, Preston had to find a new way to finance his crippling gambling addiction. He could not con his white upper-class peers anymore because they all knew he was a fraud. So he pivoted. He found a highly lucrative untapped hunting ground. He began explicitly targeting wealthy, upwardly mobile black families. Families exactly like mine. I used his race, his practiced country club manners, and his famous last name as the ultimate Trojan horse. He knew that people like my mother Vivian and my father Marcus were absolutely desperate to crack the glass ceiling of Washington, D.C.'s elite political and social circles. He preyed on their insecurities and their deep-seated desire for validation. He walked into our lives, flashing a counterfeit black card and speaking with an affected mid-Atlantic drawl, and my parents instantly fell to their knees. They handed him the keys to our kingdom without conducting a single background check, simply because he looked the part. He was not an investor. He was a highly specialized predator feeding on racial dynamics and class anxiety. He isolated his targets by making them feel exceptionally chosen by a member of the white elite while slowly draining every last cent from their bank accounts. I hit the print command, sending his sealed criminal records, his disownment papers, and his extensive list of civil judgments to my heavy-duty office printer. The machine whirred to life, spitting out page after page of undeniable proof. He is elevating this family. The words my mother had screamed at me just a few hours ago echoed mockingly in my head as I watched the printer ink dry on a restraining order filed by his own sister. He is elevating this family. The phrase repeated over and over again, syncing with the mechanical rhythm of the printer. He is elevating this family. My parents had sold their souls and my grandmother's legacy to a disgraced con artist who was literally using them as human shields to absorb his massive debts. He had targeted Kendra because she was insecure, obsessed with status, and easily manipulated by a man who promised her a life of luxury. He married her knowing she came with a family, eager to empty their pockets, just to say they had a Montgomery at their dinner table. I gathered the warm stack of papers, tapping them against my mahogany desk to align the edges. I had the weapon I needed to destroy him completely and expose the absolute rotting core of his entire operation. But exposing Preston was only half the battle. I still needed to neutralize the $2 million black market loan he and my father had illegally strapped to my grandmother's historic brownstone. I shifted my focus to the second monitor, tracing the routing numbers associated with the underground lending syndicate that held the forged deed. This was not a traditional bank subject to federal oversight. This was a shadow operation that specialized in high-interest predatory lending targeting desperate people who could not secure legitimate credit. I bypassed their encrypted firewalls using a backdoor protocol Jacqueline had conveniently included on the flash drive. I accessed their internal liquidity reports and immediately noticed a massive, glaring discrepancy. The syndicate was bleeding cash at an alarming rate. A recent federal crackdown on illegal sports betting had frozen several of their major offshore accounts, leaving them dangerously overleveraged and scrambling for capital. They were currently facing a massive liquidity crisis and were quietly trying to offload their bad debt portfolios to anonymous third-party buyers just to generate immediate operating cash. They were desperate to sell off risky loans for pennies on the dollar to anyone willing to buy the paper. I leaned closer to my monitor as a cold, predatory smile started spreading across my face, because I knew exactly what I had to do next to secure my absolute victory. I refused to simply report the illegal loan and let the slow wheels of justice drag my property through years of complicated litigation. I was going to use my vast accumulated wealth to play a game they would never see coming. I was going to become the very monster that my greedy parents and their fraudulent golden boy had blindly signed their lives away to. I would buy their debt today. I did not waste a single second guessing my decision. I picked up my encrypted phone and bypassed the trading desk, calling my personal broker directly. For 12 years, while my parents leased luxury cars to impress their Jack and Jill social circle, and Kendra maxed out credit cards to buy designer bags, I quietly funneled every bonus, every commission, and every spare dollar into a highly aggressive, heavily diversified stock portfolio. My family thought I lived in a modest condo because I could not afford better. They assumed my lack of visible luxury meant a lack of ambition. In reality, I was building an absolute fortress of wealth entirely off their radar. I ordered my broker to immediately liquidate $2.5 million in assets. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, warning me about the massive capital gains taxes and the severe financial penalty for breaking a fixed-term investment early. I cut him off abruptly. I told him I did not care about the penalties or the taxes. I needed liquid cash ready to wire by the end of the business day. The profound satisfaction of seeing the notification pop up on my screen, confirming the cash transfer into my clearing account, was intoxicating. My family had sold their souls for the grand illusion of wealth, but I held the actual keys to the kingdom. With my funds secured, I turned my attention back to the underground lending syndicate. These were not the kind of men who advertised their services or took cold calls from random accountants. But I was not a random accountant. I used my firm's secure backdoor channels to send a direct encrypted message to the managing partner of the holding company that owned the fraudulent mortgage on my grandmother's brownstone. I did not ask for a meeting, I demanded one. I cited their exact quarterly liquidity deficit, a number only a high-level insider or a forensic auditor could possibly know. I offered an immediate cash buyout for a specific toxic asset in their portfolio, and I gave them exactly 2 hours to respond. 45 minutes later, my secure terminal pinged with an address for a commercial building in downtown Washington, D.C., and a time for later that afternoon. They were biting the hook. I left my office and drove to the address provided. It was a nondescript brutalist concrete building nestled between two high-end law firms. I checked my designer coat at the front desk and was escorted by a silent, heavily armed security guard down a long, dimly lit corridor. We entered a windowless boardroom that smelled of stale cigar smoke and expensive leather. 3 men sat on the opposite side of a massive granite conference table. They wore custom suits and projected an aura of dangerous authority. They were used to dealing with desperate gamblers like Preston or foolish marks like my father Marcus. They clearly did not know what to make of a black woman walking into their den with absolute unwavering confidence. I did not sit down immediately. I tossed my briefcase onto the granite table and looked the lead broker straight in the eyes. I told him I was here to purchase the $2 million promissory note signed by Preston Montgomery III and my father. The lead broker let out a low, patronizing chuckle. He leaned back in his chair, adjusted his silk tie, and said, "They did not sell prime real estate debt to random walk-ins." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I opened my briefcase and slid a printed copy of their shadow ledgers across the table. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized exactly what he was looking at. I spoke with ice-cold precision, stripping away their intimidating facade layer by layer. I told him I knew they were currently facing a massive federal crackdown on their offshore sports betting accounts. I knew they were bleeding operating cash and were desperate to offload high-risk loans before the end of the fiscal quarter. I informed them that the deed securing the loan on my grandmother's brownstone was a proven forgery, which meant their collateral was entirely legally void. I explained that if they tried to foreclose, I would personally tie them up in federal court for a decade while exposing their entire underground lending operation to the Internal Revenue Service. The men at the table stiffened. The patronizing chuckles vanished. They realized they were not dealing with a victim. They were dealing with an apex predator who had done her homework and was ready to strike. I offered them a simple choice. They could fight me in federal court and risk exposing their entire illegal syndicate to government regulators. Or they could take a clean, untraceable wire transfer right here and now for the full principal amount of the loan, plus a 5% convenience fee for wasting my time. I pulled a digital authorization token from my pocket and set it next to the ledger. I told them the cash was ready to move instantly, but the offer expired the second I walked out of that room. The 3 men exchanged tense, silent glances. They knew a losing hand when they saw one. The lead broker finally nodded and slid a heavy leather-bound folder across the granite table. Inside was the original physical promissory note bearing the signatures of my father and my fraudulent brother-in-law. I pulled out my secure tablet, entered the authorization codes, and signed the wire transfer, pushing my life savings across the digital table. The lead broker confirmed the receipt of funds and pushed the folder into my hands. I did not just buy the debt. I secured the ultimate weapon. I walked out of that windowless room clutching the physical promissory note against my chest. I was no longer just the scapegoat daughter. I was now my family's sole creditor. The next 48 hours felt like watching a slow-motion car crash, broadcast live across every social media platform. Ignorant to the fact that the ground beneath them had just been bought out from under their feet, Kendra and Preston accelerated their delusion to a staggering pace. My phone was practically vibrating off my desk, with alerts from Kendra's relentless posting. She had hired a high-end videography team to shoot drone footage of the historic Washington, D.C. brownstone, the very property they had fraudulently mortgaged to fund Preston's gambling debts. They were officially rebranding my grandmother's hard-earned legacy as the Montgomery estate, She posted videos of herself walking through the grand foyer, holding a glass of champagne, boasting about historic architecture and generational wealth to her thousands of followers. The sheer disconnect from reality was breathtaking. The climax of their digital bragging was a formal invitation circulating through the most elite group chats in the city. They were hosting a massive one-month anniversary and housewarming gala at the Brownstone this upcoming Saturday night. The guest list was a highly curated who is who of Black Washington society. It included Legacy Jack and Jill alumni, prominent local politicians, and half the directory of her elite sorority. Kendra was weaponizing her social network, using the stolen house as the ultimate status symbol to cement her position at the absolute top of the social hierarchy. Preston was right there beside her in every single video, playing the role of the benevolent old money savior who had supposedly elevated her lifestyle and brought her family into the upper crust of high society. As I sat in my office analyzing the gala vendors and their exorbitant costs, my personal phone buzzed. It was a text message from my mother, Vivian. Even in the digital age, her words dripped with that same familiar, suffocating condescension I had endured my entire life. She did not call to apologize for showing up at my firm, screaming like a banshee and trying to destroy my career. She simply sent a text that read, "We are hosting over 200 VIP guests this Saturday. The caterers are arriving at 4. Come to the back service entrance. We need someone reliable to manage the kitchen staff and keep the servers organized. If you do this quietly and do not cause a scene, Preston said he might let you keep a key to the guest house out back." I stared at the glowing screen, my pulse steady, my breathing calm. For my entire life, this was exactly how they handled my achievements and my existence. When I passed the certified public accountant exam, Vivian asked me to do the taxes for her friend's salon for free. When I bought my first luxury sedan, Marcus asked if I could drive Kendra and her friends to their homecoming dance so they would not have to rent a limo. My value to them was strictly utilitarian. I was the help. I was the shadow that made them look brighter. Preston had effectively stolen a $4 million property, committed federal wire fraud with my father, and funneled the cash to offshore casinos and a mistress. Yet my mother was treating him like the generous lord of the manor, while offering me the absolute privilege of managing his kitchen staff in my own house. The audacity was staggering, but it was exactly the kind of arrogance I needed them to display. They were gathering every single person they had ever tried to impress into one room. They were assembling the perfect audience for their own execution. They wanted a spectacle of wealth and privilege to validate their existence. I was going to give them a spectacular financial massacre. I did not throw my phone across the room. I did not type out an angry, emotional paragraph, demanding respect, or acknowledging my hurt. Emotions were for people who did not hold the physical deed to the destruction of their enemies. I tapped the screen and typed a simple 7-word response. I would not miss it for the world. I hit send, placed my phone face down on the desk, and immediately picked up my encrypted work line. My first call was not to a lawyer or the police. My first call was to Desmond, the young photographer, whose keen eye in the darkroom had set this entire avalanche into motion. I told him to cancel any jobs he had booked for Saturday night and to completely clear his memory cards. I promised to pay triple his daily rate, provided he brought his best high-definition projection equipment, a massive portable screen, and a wireless audio transmitter. He did not ask questions. He just agreed. My second call was to a private security contractor, my forensic accounting firm frequently used during high-risk corporate asset seizures. I bypassed standard event bouncers and went straight for off-duty tactical professionals. I booked a team of 4 highly trained security operatives. I gave them the address of the brownstone and specific non-negotiable instructions. They were not there to check invitations or direct traffic for the valet. They were there to secure the perimeter, lock down the exits upon my direct command, and ensure that absolutely no one interfered with the presentation I was about to deliver. I paid their exorbitant retainer from the remaining liquid funds in my account, viewing it as the best investment I had made all year. The pieces were all falling into place with lethal precision. My parents and Preston were busy ordering imported caviar and renting crystal chandeliers with money they did not actually have, completely blind to the massive legal guillotine swinging down toward their necks. They truly thought they had successfully pushed me out the back door of my own legacy. They were about to learn that when you push the family scapegoat out into the cold, you are leaving the front door wide open for the new landlord. Saturday morning arrived with a frantic, suffocating energy inside the historic Washington district, Brownstone. Through the digital surveillance feeds I had quietly reactivated using the property's original security accounts, I watched the absolute circus unfolding inside my grandmother's house. Kendra was pacing the grand foyer in a silk robe, clutching a clipboard and screaming at a team of terrified florists. She demanded they rearrange the imported white hydrangeas for the fourth time because the current setup did not look expensive enough for the high society alumni she was trying to impress. She barked at the catering staff, threatening to withhold their payment if they dared to make eye contact with her prestigious guests. Preston was right there beside her, loudly complaining that the vintage champagne they had ordered on credit was not chilled to the exact temperature required by his supposedly elite palate. My mother Vivian was trailing behind them both aggressively, dusting antique vases that were already spotless, muttering anxiously about making sure the local politicians felt properly revered. The visual of their desperation was pathetic. They were treating my grandmother's sacred sanctuary like a cheap theatrical stage, frantically trying to construct a flawless illusion of generational wealth before the curtain went up. They were so blinded by their obsession with status that they did not notice the foundation of their entire existence had already collapsed. Miles away from their fabricated chaos, my own preparations were entirely silent. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the city. I was not rushing. I was not anxious. I slipped into a custom-tailored emerald green evening gown that commanded the room without screaming for attention. The heavy silk draped perfectly over my frame, a physical manifestation of the control I possessed. As I fastened a simple diamond clasp around my neck, my eyes locked onto the silver-framed photograph sitting on my vanity. It was a picture of my grandmother taken on the very front steps of the brownstone they were currently desecrating. Looking at her strong, unyielding face, the memories hit me with sharp clarity. I remembered sitting at her kitchen table at 10 years old, watching her meticulously balance her checkbook by hand. She had grabbed my chin gently and told me that real wealth was not about the labels on my clothes, but the ownership of the ground beneath my feet. She had scrubbed floors for arrogant people so I would never have to. She left that house in my care because she knew Vivian would pawn it for a country club membership and Marcus would lose it chasing a shortcut. My grandmother built a fortress for black generational wealth, and my family had handed the keys to a disgraced white con artist just to feel important. The burning anger in my chest localized into a cold clinical focus. I was not just going to ruin a party, I was going to perform a necessary exorcism. My phone vibrated on the marble vanity. It was a text from Desmond. He confirmed that the high-definition projection equipment was successfully smuggled inside through the catering entrance disguised as extra lighting gear. My private security team sent a ping immediately after verifying their tactical positions around the perimeter of the estate. They were dressed in plain clothes, blending perfectly into the background, ready to lock down the property the second I gave the command. Everything was now perfectly aligned. I picked up my clutch, making sure the heavy notarized promissory note was resting securely inside next to my lipstick. My phone buzzed one last time. It was another text from Vivian. She reminded me to use the alleyway entrance, commanding me to stay in the kitchen and supervise the waitstaff so Kendra would not be stressed. She added a final insulting instruction, demanding I keep my head down and not embarrass the family in front of Preston's wealthy friends. The sheer entitlement radiating from her message fueled my determination. They had no idea what was coming. I smiled at the sheer audacity and tossed the phone into my bag. I finally walked out of my building and stepped into the back of the waiting black SUV. The drive across the city felt incredibly short. The twilight sky deepened into a rich purple as we navigated the historic streets of the district. When my driver turned onto my grandmother's block, the street was already choked with luxury vehicles and aggressive valet attendants. Women in stunning evening gowns and men in tailored tuxedos were lining up outside the wrought iron gates. I could hear the elegant sweeping notes of a live string quartet drifting through the open windows of the brownstone. It was exactly the kind of pretentious high society masquerade my parents had dreamed of their entire lives. They were celebrating a stolen inheritance while rubbing shoulders with the very elite they had lied to become. My driver pulled the heavy SUV right past the line of waiting cars, stopping dead center in front of the main gate. The valet rushed forward, waving his hands and shouting that this drop-off zone was strictly reserved for VIP guests. My private security operative standing near the curb simply flashed a badge and waved the valet away. The heavy door of the SUV swung open. I did not head toward the alley. I did not look for the service entrance. I stepped out onto the cobblestone street. The emerald green silk of my gown caught the glow of the gaslight street lamps. The heavy bass of the music inside vibrated through the soles of my heels. I adjusted my diamond clasp one final time, ensuring my armor was flawless. I lifted my chin, bypassed the velvet rope, and ignored the shocked whispers of the guests waiting in line. I walked straight up the grand front steps of my own house, ready to burn their beautiful lie to the ground. The heavy oak doors of the brownstone stood wide open to welcome the warm evening air and the endless stream of wealthy guests. I stepped across the threshold and immediately felt the sheer scale of their financial delusion. My grandmother's sanctuary had been transformed into a gaudy spectacle of new money desperation. Crystal chandeliers that definitely did not belong to the original architecture had been hastily rented and hung from the ceiling. Waitstaff in crisp white uniforms floated through the crowd, carrying silver trays piled high with imported caviar and vintage champagne. At the center of the grand foyer stood Preston, holding a delicate crystal flute and charming a circle of local politicians and prominent business owners. He was playing the role of the benevolent aristocrat, to absolute perfection, smiling warmly and nodding as if he owned the very floorboards beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes. I barely took 3 steps into the foyer before my mother Vivian spotted me. Her eyes widened in absolute panic as she took in my custom emerald green gown and the diamond clasp resting at my throat. This was not the obedient silent shadow she had commanded to enter through the alleyway. She practically sprinted across the polished hardwood floor, her forced high society smile remaining frozen on her face while her eyes burned with toxic fury. She grabbed my arm with a painful pinching grip and tried to physically drag me toward the hallway leading to the catering kitchen. She leaned in close, her heavy perfume suffocating me as she hissed through clenched teeth. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing wearing designer clothes and walking through the front door. She told me the catering manager was looking for me and that I needed to go to the back immediately before Kendras saw me and suffered a panic attack. She whispered aggressively that I was deliberately trying to sabotage her perfect evening and that I needed to remember my place in this family. I looked down at her hand, tightly gripping my bare arm. I did not pull away frantically. I simply stared at her fingers until she felt the sheer weight of my authority and slowly let go. I told her that my place was exactly where I chose to stand. I reminded her that she invited me to a housewarming party, and I was simply arriving to inspect the property. I smoothly sidestepped her rigid frame, leaving her sputtering in the foyer as I walked directly into the heart of the celebration. Vivian spent my entire life telling her country club friends that I was a socially awkward bookkeeper who preferred calculators to human interaction. She desperately needed me to be the awkward spinster so Kendra could shine as the charismatic socialite. But Vivian severely underestimated the reality of my professional life. As a senior wealth manager in Washington, D.C., I did not just crunch numbers for local businesses. I managed the massive financial portfolios of the exact demographic she was currently trying to impress. I moved through the crowded ballroom with effortless grace, my emerald gown catching the light. Within 2 minutes, I was intercepted by Senator Davis, a man my parents had been trying to network with all evening. He bypassed Preston entirely and greeted me with a warm, enthusiastic handshake. He loudly thanked me for restructuring his family trust, the previous quarter saving his estate millions in federal taxes. The conversation immediately drew the attention of several other high-net-worth individuals in the room. A prominent neurosurgeon who sat on the board of Kendras' highly coveted sorority alumni chapter joined our circle. She praised my recent keynote speech at a national financial summit and asked for my business card. I handed it to her while making direct eye contact with my sister across the room. Kendra was standing by the wet bar, clutching a cocktail napkin, her jaw practically hitting the floor as she watched the most powerful women in her elite social circle treating me with absolute reverence. I was not hiding in the kitchen. I was commanding the entire room without even raising my voice. Vivian watched in pure horror from the hallway, her carefully constructed narrative about the useless older sister crumbling into dust right before her eyes. I smiled politely at the politicians and the executives answering their financial questions with sharp, engaging wit. I made sure to casually mention the importance of verifying real estate deeds and avoiding toxic offshore investments, watching the subtle nods of agreement from the seasoned investors around me. Preston noticed the shift in the room's energy. The crowd that had previously been hanging on to his fabricated stories about old money lineage was now gravitating toward the center of the room where I was holding court. The fake aristocrat was losing his audience to a black woman he had severely underestimated. I could see the panic flashing in his eyes. He needed to reclaim the spotlight before his carefully orchestrated illusion began to crack. He quickly moved toward the grand mahogany staircase, positioning himself on the third step to elevate himself above the crowd. He grabbed a heavy silver spoon and began tapping it sharply against his expensive crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound cut through the elegant jazz music and the lively chatter slowly bringing the room to a quiet halt. He cleared his throat loudly, adjusting his perfectly tailored jacket and pasting that charming predatory smile back onto his face. He called for everyone's attention, announcing that it was time to make a very special toast to family to legacy and to the beautiful future he was building with my sister. He gestured toward the massive blank wall above the fireplace where a digital projector had been installed. He promised the crowd a spectacular visual journey of their love story. I stepped away from the senator and positioned myself perfectly in the center of the room, giving me a clear view of the entire ballroom. I looked past the crowd of wealthy elites and caught Desmond's eye. He was standing casually near the catering station, completely unnoticed by my frantic family. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. I held his gaze and slowly, deliberately nodded back. Desmond reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy-duty encrypted flash drive, and quietly plugged it directly into the main audiovisual system. Desmond pushed the encrypted flash drive into the main audiovisual console hidden behind the catering station. A tiny green light blinked on the device, signaling it was securely connected to the Grand Ballroom's smart home network. Preston cleared his throat and smiled warmly at the sea of wealthy faces. He spoke with the practiced cadence of a seasoned politician. He talked about the historic significance of the Washington district and how honored he was to merge his own storied family lineage with his beautiful bride's heritage. He raised his crystal flute and declared that tonight was not just a housewarming, but the laying of a cornerstone. He looked right at Marcus and Vivian, praising them for welcoming him into their lives and helping him establish a generational empire right here in this magnificent home. Vivian was practically vibrating with pride, wiping a fake tear from her eye. Marcus puffed out his chest, looking around the room to make sure the senators and corporate executives were properly impressed by his white son-in-law. I stepped out of the shadows. The emerald silk of my gown whispered against the polished hardwood floor as I glided straight toward the center of the room. The crowd naturally parted for me. I reached Preston just as he took a breath to deliver his final toast. I did not ask for permission. I reached out and smoothly slid the microphone right out of his hand. Preston blinked in surprise, but he kept his charming smile frozen in place. He assumed I was stepping up to publicly bless his union and concede my defeat in front of high society. Vivian hissed my name from the front row, her eyes wide with sudden panic. I ignored my mother completely. I turned to face the hundreds of elite guests. I held the microphone close and let my voice carry through the state-of-the-art sound system. I told the crowd that Preston was absolutely right about one thing. Generational empires require a strong foundation. Let us look at what Preston's foundation is built on. I looked across the room and gave Desmond the signal. He tapped the enter key on his tablet. The elegant jazz music playing softly from the surround sound speakers cut off instantly. The heavy velvet curtains covering the back wall of the ballroom automatically drew back. A massive motorized projection screen descended over the antique marble fireplace. The crowd murmured in polite anticipation, expecting a romantic montage of wedding photos or a sickeningly sweet video of their honeymoon. The projector flared to life with a blinding white light. It cast a harsh glow over the elegant guests. The image that appeared on the massive screen was not a romantic sunset. It was a razor-sharp high-definition photograph taken from the bridal suite balcony on the morning of the wedding. It showed Preston Montgomery III in his tailored tuxedo pants, with his hands aggressively gripping the bare waist of Kendras' maid of honor. It was flawless, capturing the undeniable passion and intimacy of their embrace. And there, resting clearly on the glass patio table beside them, was the original forged deed to my grandmother's $4 million property. The entire ballroom plunged into a dead, horrifying silence. The sudden quiet was so absolute that I could hear the hum of the cooling fan inside the projector. A collective gasp violently ripped through the crowd of esteemed politicians, Jack and Jill alumni, and elite sorority sisters. The women in the front row brought their hands to their mouths in shock. The wealthy investors I had been networking with just moments ago stared at the screen with absolute disgust. The maid of honor was actually standing near the open bar. As the crowd recognized her face on the massive screen, the guests immediately stepped away from her. A brutal, empty circle formed around her, as if she carried a highly contagious disease. She covered her face with her designer clutch and bolted toward the service exit. Kendra was standing just a few feet away from the projection screen. Her eyes were locked onto the 10-foot-tall image of her husband violating her best friend. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost in her expensive designer dress. Her fingers went entirely limp. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp and hit the hardwood floor. The sharp sound of shattering glass broke the paralyzing silence of the room. Golden liquid splashed across the toes of her expensive heels, but she did not even flinch. She just kept staring at the screen, her breathing shallow and ragged. Preston finally snapped out of his shock. His face turned a violent shade of red. He lunged toward me, trying to snatch the microphone back. He shouted for someone to cut the power, demanding that the security guards confiscate the projector. He yelled that this was a deep fake, a malicious attack created by a jealous spinster. I gracefully sidestepped his clumsy grab. I pulled a small wireless remote clicker from my clutch and held it up. Before Preston could scream another word of defense or convince my desperate parents that the photograph was a fabrication, I pressed the button. The image on the massive screen vanished and was instantly replaced by a stark black and white financial document. It was a certified banking ledger blown up to massive proportions so that even the guests in the back of the room could read the numbers clearly. I raised the microphone back to my lips, leaning into my role as a senior wealth manager. I directed the crowd's attention to the screen, using a digital laser pointer to highlight a specific block of routing numbers. I explained to the room of seasoned financial experts exactly what they were looking at. I narrated the flow of stolen money with ice-cold precision. I pointed to the exact timestamp, showing a wire transfer of $500,000 moving from a shadowy offshore holding company directly into a domestic account. Then I clicked the laser pointer onto the name of the receiving account holder. It was the maid of honor. The final line of the ledger showed the exact purpose of the wire transfer. It was a down payment for a luxury penthouse apartment in Arlington, Virginia. I looked at Kendra and watched her entire fabricated high society world burn to ash. The silence that followed my final words held for exactly 1 second before the sheer force of the truth shattered the room. Kendra let out a guttural, agonizing scream that tore through the elegant ballroom. She did not freeze and she did not cry. She turned on her heel, her eyes locking onto her maid of honor, who was frantically trying to push her way through a crowd of shocked politicians near the service exit. Kendra lunged. She tackled her best friend right into a tiered tower of champagne glasses. The collision sent hundreds of crystal flutes crashing to the hardwood floor in an explosive wave of sparkling wine and shattered glass. The maid of honor shrieked as Kendra grabbed a fistful of her expensive hair, dragging her across the floor and screaming about the Arlington penthouse. The two women rolled through the spilled caviar, tearing at each other's designer dresses, while the esteemed guests scrambled backward to avoid the blood and champagne. My father Marcus completely panicked. Seeing his golden child rolling on the floor and his pathway to high society evaporating before his eyes, he abandoned all pretense of dignity. He charged the fireplace, desperately searching for the thick black power cord, connecting the projector to the wall outlet. He grabbed the heavy cable with both hands and violently yanked it from the socket, panting and sweating, as if pulling the plug would somehow erase the reality we had all just witnessed. He turned to the crowd with a forced manic smile, trying to shout over Kendra's ongoing assault that this was just a technical malfunction and a cruel prank. He severely underestimated my preparation. I looked at Desmond, who simply tapped his tablet. The massive screen flickered for a fraction of a second before the backup battery kicked in flawlessly, shifting to the wireless projection feed we had established hours ago. The image of the bank ledger vanished, only to be instantly replaced by something far more devastating. I raised the microphone back to my lips, my voice echoing clearly over the sounds of my sister brawling on the floor. I told my father that pulling a plug does not stop a federal audit. I clicked my remote. The screen filled with the official notarized legal documents from the Montgomery Family Trust. The bold black text outlined the absolute disownment of Preston Montgomery III. I read the highlights aloud for the guests in the back. I detailed how Preston was completely legally severed from the Montgomery fortune 5 years ago for orchestrating a massive Ponzi scheme that specifically targeted elderly widows. I clicked to the next slide. A timeline of his criminal record flashed across the screen, detailing civil judgments, massive casino debts, and active federal fraud alerts, warning affluent communities about his predatory tactics. I explained to the horrified crowd that Preston was not a trust fund heir, bringing generational wealth to our community. He was a disgraced broke white con artist who targeted upwardly mobile black families because he knew their desperation for status made them the perfect gullible victims. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and utterly merciless. These were proud, highly educated professionals, politicians, and legacy society members who realized they had been invited to celebrate a parasite. Cell phones materialized from every clutch and tuxedo pocket in the room. Flashes went off as dozens of influential guests recorded the undeniable proof of Preston's fraudulent existence. A prominent judge in the front row scoffed loudly, turning her back on my mother Vivian, who was standing frozen by the staircase. Kendra's sorority sisters, women, who had previously envied her supposedly elite marriage, were now broadcasting her monumental humiliation on live streams. The social execution was absolute. There would be no recovering from this. The story would hit the local blogs before the night was over, and the family name Vivian had tried so desperately to elevate would be synonymous with the greatest grift in modern Washington history. Vivian clamped her hands over hers, but she could not block out the relentless clicking of smartphone cameras, capturing the absolute destruction of her social climbing dreams. Every single person she had ever tried to impress was now looking at her with an intense, cutting mixture of pity and severe revulsion. Preston finally broke. The polished, charming facade he had used to swindle my parents completely melted away, revealing the desperate, cornered criminal underneath. His face turned a violent, mottled shade of crimson. He ignored his wife, who was currently being pulled off her bleeding maid of honor by 2 caterers. He marched directly toward me, his hands balled into tight fists, his breathing heavy and erratic. He tried to snatch the microphone again, but my private security operatives finally stepped out of the shadows. 2 massive, plainclothed professionals flanked me instantly, crossing their arms and staring Preston down with silent, lethal intent. Preston stopped in his tracks, realizing he could not physically intimidate me anymore. He resorted to the only weapon he thought he still had left. He puffed out his chest, pointed a shaking finger at my face, and screamed at the top of his lungs. He demanded that I get out of his house. He yelled that he was the master of this estate, that he had legal ownership of the property, and that I was nothing but a jealous, bitter trespasser who was trying to ruin his life. He turned to the crowd, his voice cracking with panicked rage, and shouted that he was calling the police right now to have me arrested and dragged out in handcuffs. He promised to see me rot in a jail cell for breaking and entering, fully believing that his name and his race would instantly command the local authorities to do his bidding and remove the angry black woman from his presence. He sneered at the security guards, demanding they restrain me, while he violently patted down his tuxedo pockets, searching for his phone to dial emergency services. He told the remaining guests to stay right where they were, promising them a spectacular show when the cops arrived to haul me away. I did not back away from his screaming face. I did not flinch at his desperate, hollow threats of legal action. I lowered the microphone, handed it to one of my security guards, and stood my ground with absolute flawless composure. I slowly reached into my emerald silk clutch, letting my fingers trace the heavy folded edges of the highly classified document I had brought with me to deliver the final execution. I withdrew my hand from the emerald silk clutch, grasping the heavy folded edges of the original notarized document. The ballroom was completely paralyzed. The only sounds remaining were the panicked breaths of Kendra kneeling in a puddle of champagne and blood, and the distant wail of a police siren echoing through the historic streets. Preston stood before me, his chest heaving, his face slick with sweat. He held his phone, glaring at me with the absolute certainty of a man who believed his white privilege would shield him from consequence. He told me the police were 2 minutes away, and I would be leaving the estate in handcuffs. I did not flinch. I opened the leather-bound folder I pulled from my clutch and held up the heavily stamped original promissory note for the entire room to see. The thick red ink of the official notary seals caught the light from the rented crystal chandeliers overhead. I looked directly at Preston and asked him if he actually understood how property law worked in the District of Columbia. I explained to the crowd of silenced elites that a forged deed does not make you the legal owner of a $4 million historic brownstone. I pointed to the projection screen, which still displayed his criminal record, and told him my forensic team had authenticated the original deed. My signature was a proven forgery. That meant the transfer of ownership was completely null and void. The house never belonged to him. It never belonged to my parents. The property instantly legally reverted back to the protected generational trust established by my late grandmother. I am the sole executor of that trust. Therefore, I am the sole legal owner of the estate he was currently trespassing in. Preston blinked, his arrogant smirk faltering for the very first time. My father Marcus suddenly pushed his way past a group of stunned politicians, his face a mask of absolute terror. He stared at the leather-bound folder in my hands, his eyes widening as he recognized the thick embossed paper of the shadow lending syndicate. Marcus tried to stammer out a defense, claiming that if the deed was fake, then the loan was fake too. He desperately told the crowd that the bank would just cancel the transaction and everything would go back to normal. I turned my gaze to my father, letting the sheer weight of his financial ignorance crush him. I told him he was deeply mistaken. I explained that while the fraudulent deed invalidated their ownership of the physical house, it did not invalidate the $2 million in raw cash they borrowed from an underground credit syndicate. I held the promissory note higher, tapping my manicured finger against the two signatures at the bottom of the page. I read their names aloud: Preston Montgomery III and Marcus Williams. I announced they had personally co-signed a binding, uncollateralized $2 million black market loan. They had taken the money and willfully spent it on offshore casinos and a luxury penthouse in Arlington. The debt was entirely undeniably real, and it was legally tied to their personal social security numbers, not the house. My mother, Vivian, let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as she realized the catastrophic magnitude of their mistake. She allowed her husband to sign away their entire financial future just to secure a worthless son-in-law who promised her access to elite country clubs. Kendra was sobbing uncontrollably on the floor. Her designer dress ruined her high society dreams, annihilated by the very man she thought was her golden ticket. She looked up at Preston, screaming at him, demanding to know how he could have been so stupid to borrow money from a shadow syndicate. Preston frantically shook his head, stepping backward. He raised his voice, trying to sound authoritative, but his tone was laced with pure panic. He told me it did not matter who held the original note because the syndicate was bleeding cash and currently under federal investigation. He bragged that the lenders would be too busy dodging the Internal Revenue Service to ever collect the debt from him. He actually smiled a desperate, pathetic smile, believing he had found a technical loophole to escape his consequences. I lowered the document and looked at him with an expression of clinical, predatory calm. I told Preston that he was absolutely right about the syndicate facing a severe liquidity crisis. I informed him that they were so desperate for operating cash that they had liquidated their bad debt portfolios earlier this afternoon. I took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance until I was looking directly into his terrified eyes. I told him that I did not just call the authorities to report his fraud. I told him that I had liquidated $2.5 million of my own hidden stock portfolio. I had walked into a windowless boardroom downtown and negotiated a direct cash buyout for his specific toxic asset. The realization hit Preston like a physical blow. He staggered backward, bumping into the catering table. Marcus grabbed his own hair, letting out a low, guttural sound of pure despair as the trap slammed shut around his neck. Vivian fell to her knees beside Kendra, weeping openly in front of the very elite socialites she had spent decades trying to impress. They were completely surrounded with absolutely no way out. The lavish housewarming gala had transformed into a public financial execution. I turned my attention away from the trembling grifter and looked dead into my parents' eyes, the people who had spent my entire life calling me a bitter, loveless spinster. The people who had sacrificed my grandmother's sacred legacy to fund a lie. I held the promissory note steady, my voice echoing through the grand ballroom. I bought your debt. I am the bank. This house is in default, and you have exactly 30 minutes to vacate my property. The flashing red and blue lights of multiple squad cars pierced through the tall historic windows, casting erratic shadows across the rented crystal chandeliers. The wail of approaching sirens grew deafeningly loud before abruptly cutting off right outside the front steps. Heavy boots stomped loudly against the cobblestone. My private security operative stepped aside to let the authorities through. The grand oak doors were pushed wide open. 4 uniformed Metropolitan Police Department officers and 2 federal eviction marshals strode into the grand foyer. Their tactical gear starkly contrasted with the silk and velvet evening wear of the terrified high society guests. The elite crowd instantly parted like the Red Sea, desperate to avoid any association with a sudden criminal raid. Preston immediately saw the uniforms and his entire demeanor shifted from arrogant to defensive. He smoothed down his wrinkled tuxedo jacket and puffed out his chest, falling back on the only defense mechanism he had ever truly relied on. He marched straight up to the lead officer, a tall, imposing black man, with decades of experience written across his face. Preston completely ignored the chaotic state of the ballroom and attempted to leverage his race and his fabricated old money lineage. I used a loud, commanding voice, demanding that the officers arrest me immediately. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and yelled that I was a deranged, disgruntled relative who had broken into his private estate to ruin a high society gala. He name-dropped local judges claiming his family built the city and that he would have the officers' badges stripped by morning if they did not put me in handcuffs right this second. He leaned in close, expecting the black policeman to automatically defer to a wealthy white man in a multi-million-dollar house. The lead officer did not even blink twice. He looked at Preston with an expression of absolute stone-cold indifference. He did not reach for his cuffs. He simply stepped around the frantic grifter and walked directly toward me. I did not raise my voice or try to match Preston's hysterical shouting. I calmly reached into my designer briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavily tabbed legal binder. This was a flawless, ironclad execution warrant prepared by the finest forensic accounting team in the capital. I handed the binder to the lead officer, holding his gaze with professional respect. I informed him that he would find the original forged deed, the verified promissory note from the underground lending syndicate, and the complete wire transfer logs proving the theft of funds. I also pointed out the expedited federal fraud alert issued by the Treasury Department and the active arrest warrant signed by a federal judge just 2 hours ago today. Preston scoffed loudly, throwing his hands up in the air. He turned to the crowd of wealthy elites pacing back and forth like a caged animal. He shouted that the documents were fake and that I had manufactured the entire thing out of pure jealousy because I could not stand to see my younger sister marry into a prominent family. He looked over at my father Marcus, demanding that he intervene. He yelled at Marcus to tell the police that I was mentally unstable. Marcus stood completely frozen, his eyes darting between the police officers and the undeniable legal binder. He knew that uttering a single word of defense for Preston would make him an active co-conspirator in front of federal marshals. My father lowered his head and took a deliberate step away from his golden son-in-law, abandoning him to the wolves. My mother, Vivian, let out a loud, strangled sob, clutching her chest as she realized there was no escaping this nightmare. She watched her entire fabricated reality crumble as the elite guests whispered and pointed their phone cameras at her humiliated family. She had spent my entire life telling me that I needed to step aside so my sister could shine. Now Kendra was sitting in a puddle of spilled champagne and blood. Her designer gown ruined, her makeup running down her face as she stared blankly at the man who had completely destroyed her life. Preston realized he was losing his audience. His face turned a deep shade of purple, and he lunged toward me again, screaming that he would destroy me. He yelled that he was a Montgomery, and that I was nothing but a low-level accountant. My private security detail stepped forward, instantly blocking his path completely. Preston bounced off the security guard like a rag doll, stumbling backward into the catering table. The lead officer finished reviewing the heavily stamped legal documents in the binder. He closed the folder with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed through the dead silent ballroom. He handed the binder back to me with a respectful nod, acknowledging the flawless preparation of my case. He turned slowly and faced Preston. The officer's voice was low, calm, and terrifying. He stated that the documents were fully verified and the federal warrant was active. Preston shook his head frantically, taking another step back until his back hit the cold marble fireplace. He stammered that it was a misunderstanding and that he had powerful lawyers on retainer who would crush the department with a massive lawsuit. He demanded his phone, screaming that he needed to call his grandfather to sort this out right now. The lead officer did not entertain the pathetic tantrum for a second. He reached to his tactical belt and unclipped his restraints. The sharp metallic jingle cut through the heavy air of the room. He stepped right into Preston's personal space, completely dominating the disgraced con artist. He grabbed Preston's wrist, twisting his arm tightly behind his back, with practiced, swift efficiency. Preston Montgomery III, you are under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, and identity theft. The loud, unmistakable click of the heavy, cold metal cuffs echoed through the dead silent ballroom, sealing his fate. Preston thrashed against the relentless grip of the two massive police officers. The pristine tailoring of his imported linen suit tore at the shoulder seam as he desperately tried to pull away from the heavy steel cuffs binding his wrists. His face was a mask of feral panic. The charming aristocrat was dead. In his place was a cornered street grifter, stripped of his unearned privilege. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an ally, but found only a solid wall of disgusted stares from the black elites he had attempted to swindle. When his eyes locked onto my parents, Vivian and Marcus, he stopped fighting the police. Instead, he unleashed a torrent of absolute venom. Preston spat on the polished hardwood floor right at my father's expensive leather shoes. He screamed that they were pathetic, status-obsessed fools who were practically begging to be conned. He laughed, a harsh, manic sound that bounced off the rented crystal chandeliers overhead. He yelled that he did not even have to try hard to steal their legacy. He told the entire ballroom that Marcus and Vivian had handed him the keys to a $4 million historic property simply because he was a white man with a recognizable last name. He mocked my mother's desperate thirst for country club invitations and high society validation, claiming it was the easiest grift he had ever executed. He shouted that they were so eager to buy their way into elite circles that they blindly signed a $2 million black market loan without reading a single page of the paperwork. He called them gullible, insecure, and utterly desperate. He laughed at how easily they sacrificed their own daughter just to appease him. The officers yanked Preston backward, forcing him toward the grand entrance, but he kept screaming his insults. His voice echoed down the historic street as he was shoved into the back of a waiting squad car, the heavy door slamming shut on his fabricated empire. Inside the ballroom, the illusion of the Montgomery estate completely disintegrated. Kendra remained on her knees amid the shattered crystal and spilled champagne, Her designer gown was soaked and stained with blood from her brawl with her former best friend. She looked frantically around the room at the politicians, the prominent doctors, and her beloved sorority sisters. These were the people she had spent her entire adult life trying to impress. She had ridiculed my career and mocked my single status, just to secure her place among them. Now she was legally bound to a broke felon and utterly exposed as a massive fraud. She crawled forward on her bruised knees, reaching out to grab the hem of a prominent judge's evening gown. Kendra begged the guests to stay, pleading that the party was not over. She cried out that she was a victim, that she had no idea her husband was a criminal. She desperately tried to salvage her social standing, sobbing that she was still a prominent alumni, respected member of their elite circles, and someone who deserved their unwavering loyalty. The judge slowly pulled her dress away from Kendra's desperate grasp, brushing the fabric as if wiping away a highly contagious disease. No one offered her a hand to stand up. No one offered a single word of comfort. The high society guests turned their backs in unison, perfectly synchronized in their absolute disgust. They gathered their coats and designer clutches, walking past my sister without a second glance. They whispered about the forged deed, the underground loan, and the spectacular public humiliation they had just witnessed. The social execution was swift and merciless. Kendra watched her entire fabricated reality walk right out the front door, leaving her with nothing but a mountain of credit card debt and a completely ruined reputation. Marcus stood perfectly frozen near the antique marble fireplace, unable to process his catastrophic downfall. His shoulders slumped forward, and he looked 20 years older than he had just an hour ago. He stared blankly at the empty space where Preston had been standing, finally realizing that his boundless greed had cost him absolutely everything. He had forged my signature, committed a severe federal crime, and signed away his entire financial future, all for a fraudulent promise of elite status. He had traded his own daughter's legacy for a seat at a table that did not even exist. The devastating reality of his massive financial ruin paralyzed him completely. Vivian, however, refused to accept defeat. She watched the last of her wealthy guests exit the grand foyer, her dreams of rubbing shoulders with the political elite turning to ash before her very eyes. A profound, inescapable panic finally overrode her stubborn pride as the silent mansion mocked. She whipped her head around and locked her eyes directly onto me. She stumbled across the room, her expensive heels slipping on the wet floorboards. She threw herself at me, grasping both of my hands with a desperate, bruising grip. Her fingers dug into my skin, shaking violently, as heavy tears streamed down her perfectly contoured face. The arrogant matriarch who had commanded me to hide in the catering kitchen just hours ago was now weeping like a terrified child. She had spent my entire life telling me I was a bitter disappointment, but now she needed me to be her savior. I did not pull my hands away immediately. I stood perfectly still, letting her feel the cold, immovable reality of my presence. The same woman who had happily watched Preston threaten my accounting license was now begging for my mercy. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with sheer desperation. Her voice cracked as she delivered the ultimate manipulation tactic she had used to control me since I was a little girl. "Valerie, please, you have to stop this. We are your parents. You cannot put us out on the street. Family first. Family always comes first, Valerie, I am begging you." I looked down at my mother's hands, violently clutching my own. Her expensive French manicure dug sharply into my skin. This was the same woman who had spent my entire life pushing me into the shadows so she could bask in the artificial light of my sister's fabricated achievements. Now her perfectly contoured face was streaked with running mascara and pure, unadulterated terror. She squeezed my fingers tighter, crying out about family loyalty and bloodlines. I did not flinch. I did not offer her a single ounce of comfort. With agonizing slowness, I lifted my arms and deliberately peeled her trembling fingers off my wrists one by one. I stepped back, creating a physical boundary that mirrored the permanent emotional wall I had just erected between us. "Family first, you say?" My voice was dangerously quiet, but it carried perfectly through the grand foyer. I looked at her with clinical detachment. "Let your sister shine, right, Mom? That was your favorite command. Let Kendra have the spotlight. Let Kendra have the resources. I tilted my head, studying the absolute wreck she had become. And Preston. He is elevating this family right. He is the old money savior who was going to validate your entire existence and get you into the country club. I repeated her own toxic phrases back to her, watching each word strike her like a physical blow. You were so desperate to be accepted by the white elite that you gladly handed a known con artist the deed to a house my black grandmother scrubbed floors for decades to afford. You threw away our actual generational wealth for a cheap illusion. You elevated a parasite, and you expected me to gladly finance the entire charade. Vivian opened her mouth to argue, to spin another web of excuses, but the harsh truth choked her. She looked around the ruined ballroom. The remaining police officers stood by the entrance, arms crossed, showing zero sympathy. The eviction marshals held their clipboards, waiting for my command. Kendra was still sobbing near the shattered champagne tower, her ruined designer gown clinging to her bruised knees. My sister tried to crawl toward me, begging for a second chance, crying that she had been manipulated by Preston and that she needed her big sister to protect her. I looked down at Kendra and told her that her days of using me as a human shield were permanently over. I informed her that the elite society she worshipped had just watched her husband get dragged away in handcuffs for fraud. I reminded her that the people she had tried to impress would never return her phone calls again. She was officially a social pariah in Washington, D.C., and no amount of fake tears would ever repair the damage she had done to her own name. I turned my back on my sister and pointed directly at the massive antique grandfather clock standing in the main hallway. The heavy brass pendulum swung back and forth, the rhythmic ticking echoing through the silent house. It was the very first piece of furniture my grandmother had purchased when she bought the brownstone. 20 minutes left, I announced, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. The eviction marshals are waiting. You will go upstairs and you will pack your belongings into heavy-duty black trash bags. You will not use the vintage leather luggage my grandmother left behind. You will not take the silver cutlery, the original oil paintings, or a single piece of antique jewelry. If I see either of you trying to sneak so much as a silver teaspoon out of this house, I will have the officers arrest you for theft right here in the foyer." Vivian gasped, pressing a hand over her mouth. The sheer indignity of carrying her expensive designer clothes out of a $4 million mansion in black garbage bags was too much for her fragile ego to process. She looked at Marcus, desperately pleading with him to do something to fix the catastrophic mess he had orchestrated. Marcus was sweating profusely. His tailored suit clung to his back and his eyes darted frantically around the room. He looked at the police officers blocking the front door. He looked at the marshals checking their watches. He realized he had absolutely no legal leverage, no financial escape route, and no way to bully his way out of the consequences. His pride was completely shattered. With his back pushed firmly against the wall, my father resorted to the most pathetic manipulation tactic imaginable. He suddenly gasped loudly, clutching his chest with both hands. He staggered backward, his face contorting into a mask of exaggerated agony. He let out a loud groan and collapsed dramatically against the marble fireplace, sliding down to the hardwood floor. Vivian immediately began screaming hysterically. She dropped to her knees beside him, crying out that I was giving her husband a fatal heart attack. She wailed that the stress of my cruelty was literally killing him right in front of my eyes. She demanded that the police officers arrest me for causing a medical emergency. Kendra joined in the screaming, trying to play the devastated daughter crying for someone to save her father. They expected me to panic. They expected me to drop the eviction notice, rush to his side, and beg for his forgiveness out of sheer guilt. I simply crossed my arms and stared down at his theatrical performance. The lead police officer immediately radioed for medical assistance, calling the emergency medical technicians, who were already staging outside the property due to the earlier physical altercation between Kendra and the bridesmaid. Less than 2 minutes later, 3 paramedics rushed through the front doors carrying heavy trauma bags and a portable electrocardiogram machine. They pushed past Vivian and immediately went to work on Marcus. They unbuttoned his expensive dress shirt, applying monitoring pads to his chest and checking his pulse with urgent clinical efficiency. Vivian continued to sob loudly, putting on a show for the police officers, crying that my father was a respected dentist who did not deserve this kind of stress. She played the role of the terrified wife flawlessly. The lead paramedic stared at the digital monitor reading Marcus' vitals. He checked the screen a second time, his brow furrowing in confusion. He took out a stethoscope and listened to my father's chest for several seconds. The tense atmosphere in the room completely evaporated as the paramedic let out an annoyed sigh. He stood up, ripped the Velcro blood pressure cuff off my father's arm, and looked directly at the police officers. The paramedic announced in a loud, incredibly irritated voice that Marcus had a resting heart rate of 80 beats per minute and flawless blood pressure. He told the entire room that there was absolutely nothing wrong with his heart and that he was entirely faking the medical emergency. He warned Marcus that faking a heart attack to avoid law enforcement was a severe misuse of city emergency resources. The silence that fell over the grand foyer was heavier and far more humiliating than anything that had happened all night. The police officers glared at Marcus with absolute disgust. The lead officer stepped forward, resting his hand on his utility belt. He looked down at my father lying on the marble floor pretending to be a victim. The officer sternly commanded Marcus to get off the floor, stop wasting taxpayer resources, and grab his trash bags. The extreme public humiliation of being exposed as a pathetic fraud in front of law enforcement, federal marshals, and medical professionals was the final devastating blow. Marcus slowly scrambled to his feet, his face burning with a shame so deep he could not even make eye contact with his own wife. An eviction marshal dropped heavy-duty black industrial trash bags onto the polished hardwood floor. The plastic slapped against the wood with a sharp, offensive smack. He gave them exactly 14 minutes before they would be physically escorted off the premises. Vivian stared at the black plastic bags as if they were venomous snakes. She demanded proper moving boxes, but the marshal tapped his wristwatch, warning her that anything left inside after the deadline became my property. That single threat finally broke through Vivian's profound delusion. Panic completely overrode her vanity. She snatched the bags and sprinted up the grand mahogany staircase. Marcus and Kendra followed right behind her, tripping over their own feet in a desperate rush to salvage their designer wardrobes. I walked upstairs behind them, my emerald gown sweeping gracefully across the steps. I was not going to let them out of my sight for a single second. I leaned against the master suite doorframe, watching the chaos unfold. Vivian was shoving thousands of dollars worth of custom silk dresses into the cheap black plastic. The garments wrinkled as she violently packed them. She moved toward my grandmother's antique cherry wood vanity, quickly attempting to slip a vintage diamond brooch into her pocket. I stepped into the room, clearing my throat loudly. I reminded her that the police were still waiting downstairs, and I could easily have her strip-searched for grand larceny. Vivian froze, her face twisted with bitter hatred. She pulled the brooch from her pocket, dropping it back onto the vanity. Her hands shook with suppressed rage. Down the hall, Kendra was having a psychological breakdown. She sat on the guest bedroom floor, weeping hysterically as she shoved her expensive designer shoes into a garbage bag. The heels punctured the thin plastic. The glamorous high society bride was reduced to a weeping mess sitting among garbage. I checked my watch and announced that their time was officially up. The marshals moved in, instantly ordering them to drop everything else and proceed to the front door. They dragged their overstuffed black trash bags down the main staircase, making a pathetic scraping sound. In the grand foyer, I instructed the marshals to open the heavy front doors wide. The warm evening air rushed into the house, carrying the sound of murmuring voices. The elite guests had not gone home. The local politicians and high society matriarchs were all standing out on the cobblestone sidewalk, waiting under the glow of the gaslight street lamps, specifically to witness the final act of this spectacular downfall. Marcus walked out first, his head bowed, dragging two bulging trash bags behind him. Vivian followed desperately, trying to hide her tear-stained face behind her oversized designer clutch, refusing to look at the people she had spent decades trying to impress. The crowd of elites parted instantly, creating a wide, brutal path of isolation for them to walk through. No one offered to help them. No one offered a ride. The rejection was absolute and completely unforgiving. Kendra stepped out onto the porch, her ruined wedding dress clinging to her legs. As she walked down the stone steps, the leadership council of her highly coveted sorority chapter stepped directly into her path. They were dressed in shades of salmon pink and apple green. A woman who commanded immense respect, the president held her hand up, signaling Kendra to stop. Kendra let go of her trash bag, sobbing and begging her sisters for support. The president did not offer a hug. She looked at Kendra with pure Arctic disdain. She stated that bringing a felonious grifter into their sacred sisterhood and conspiring to defraud her own blood relative violated every oath she had ever taken. The president extended her open palm, demanding the immediate return of Kendra's official chapter pin. Kendra gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. She begged them not to do this, crying that her social life would be completely over. The women surrounding the president crossed their arms in unison. A silent, impenetrable wall of judgment. Kendra realized she had absolutely no choice. With trembling fingers, she reached up to the lapel of her ruined dress and unclasped the jeweled pin. She dropped it into the president's hand, her tears splashing onto the concrete. The sorority sisters immediately turned their backs on her, walking away without looking back. The alumni standing nearby followed suit, physically turning away as Marcus and Vivian dragged their garbage bags past them. They were officially excommunicated from the only world they had ever cared about. They reached the end of the long driveway, standing on the curb with their trash bags piled around their feet. Preston had arrived in a rented luxury SUV, which the police had already impounded as evidence of his wire fraud. They had absolutely no vehicles and no way to leave the neighborhood since the rental was seized. Marcus had to pull out his phone to call a basic city cab, while the elite crowd watched them in utter silence. I stood at the very top of the grand stone steps, bathed in the warm light pouring from the foyer. The cool night breeze brushed against my face, bringing a profound sense of absolute clarity to my mind. Vivian looked back up the driveway one last time. Her eyes searched mine for a single sliver of mercy or regret. She found absolutely none. My posture was unyielding. My expression was carved from solid stone. I took a deliberate step backward into the grand foyer of my grandmother's historic estate. I reached out and grabbed the polished brass handles of the heavy oak doors. I pulled them closed, drawing the massive weight of the wood together. The thick oak doors slammed shut, echoing loudly through the quiet historic street with a resounding and permanent thud, sealing their fate forever. It has been exactly 30 days since the thick oak doors slammed shut, echoing loudly through the quiet historic street with a resounding and permanent thud, sealing their fate forever. The cool night air had quickly washed away the stench of their entitlement, leaving behind nothing but the undeniable reality of their collapse. 1 month is a relatively short period of time in the grand scheme of a lifetime, but it was more than enough time to completely dismantle the fraudulent empire they had tried to build on my back. I did not have to lift another finger or orchestrate any further elaborate schemes. The natural, brutal consequences of their own actions simply took the wheel and drove them straight off a financial cliff. Preston Montgomery III was currently residing in a federal detention center without the option of bail. The prosecuting attorneys argued successfully that a man with a history of offshore wire transfers and a network of black market syndicates was an extreme flight risk. His high-priced defense attorney vanished the very second the initial retainer check bounced. Preston was now relying on an overworked public defender who had absolutely zero sympathy for a disgraced white-collar con artist. His scheduled court dates were a relentless parade of mounting felony charges ranging from grand larceny to aggravated identity theft. The mighty Montgomery name, which he had weaponized to intimidate my parents into submission, offered absolutely no protection behind cinderblock walls and razor wire. The Montgomery family patriarch even released a scathing public statement to the press, explicitly condemning Preston's actions and reaffirming that he had been legally and permanently exiled from their lineage years ago. Preston was trapped in a tiny cell, stripped of his tailored suits and his counterfeit charm, facing decades in federal prison. Kendra was living a waking nightmare she had once actively mocked. Stripped of her fake elite status and formally ousted by her prestigious sorority network, she faced a brutal, terrifying financial reality. Preston had maliciously opened and maxed out multiple credit cards in her name before his arrest, leaving her drowning under a mountain of high-interest debt. The luxury lifestyle she constantly bragged about on social media was entirely repossessed. She was forced to take a minimum wage retail job at a discount department store just to afford the deposit on a cramped studio apartment. The golden child who used to sip imported champagne and belittle my accounting career was now spending her days folding discounted sweaters for minimum wage. The ultimate humiliation came when members of her former elite social circles would walk into the store, recognize her, and quickly turn the other way, whispering behind their hands. She spent her meager lunch breaks navigating a messy, fiercely contested divorce, trying to legally separate herself from a federal inmate while dodging relentless aggressive calls from debt collectors. She was finally experiencing the real unforgiving world without a safety net, and the sheer weight of it was tearing her apart. Vivian and Marcus were not faring any better. The $2 million black market loan they foolishly co-signed did not just evaporate into thin air when the police arrived. When they inevitably defaulted on the payment terms, I immediately executed my rights as their sole legal creditor. I did not seize their assets out of petty emotional revenge. I executed a ruthless, perfectly legal financial collection. To avoid total bankruptcy and keep themselves out of federal prison for their complicity in the forged deed, they had to completely liquidate their entire retirement portfolios. Marcus was forced to sell his struggling dental practice for pennies on the dollar, just to cover their mounting legal defense fees and the exorbitant interest rates I legally applied to their outstanding debt. The pristine suburban mansion they used to host their pretentious charity dinners was seized by the bank and quickly auctioned off to the highest bidder. My parents now rented a tiny, poorly insulated two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The unit was situated directly over a noisy 24-hour commercial laundromat. Vivian, who used to throw a massive tantrum if her imported wine was served at the wrong temperature, now had to listen to industrial washing machines rattling her cheap floorboards every single night. The smell of commercial bleach constantly seeped through their floor vents. They had lost their pensions, their property, their cars, and their precious social standing. Their country club friends completely abandoned them, treating them like absolute pariahs. Whenever Vivian tried to show her face at local community events, the other women would physically turn their backs and refuse to acknowledge her presence. They were living the exact impoverished life they had always been terrified of, and they had absolutely no one to blame but their own toxic greed. I observed all of this from a clinical, peaceful distance. My forensic accounting firm had easily finalized the legal cleanup of the historic brownstone. The title was crystal clear, and the property was permanently secured within the generational trust, exactly as my grandmother had intended. I spent my mornings drinking premium coffee on the very balcony where Preston had foolishly sealed his own doom. The silence in the massive house was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was incredibly light and full of boundless possibility. I had successfully excised the parasitic tumors that had been feeding on my success for over 3 decades. As I sat at my grandmother's refurbished cherry wood dining table, reviewing the architectural blueprints for the next phase of the brownstone's renovation, my secure mobile phone suddenly vibrated against the polished surface. The screen lit up, displaying a text message from an unsaved number, but I recognized the digits immediately. It was Kendra. I picked up the device and calmly read the notification. The words were a stark, pathetic contrast to the arrogant, cruel insults she used to hurl at me. She wrote that she was so incredibly sorry for everything and that she had completely hit rock bottom. She begged me for a small temporary loan just so she could afford to buy basic groceries for the week, claiming she had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days. I stared at the glowing screen of my secure mobile phone, letting the sheer desperation of Kendra's message wash over me. She was begging for grocery money, claiming she had hit absolute rock bottom. I did not immediately type a response. I simply set the device face down on the polished surface of my grandmother's refurbished cherry wood dining table. The heavy, suffocating energy that my family used to bring into this space was completely gone. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp scent of fresh paint and lemon oil fill my lungs. The historic Washington District brownstone had undergone a massive, meticulous transformation over the past month. I did not just hire contractors to repair the damage from their gaudy housewarming party. I completely gutted the first floor, stripping away every single trace of Vivian's pretentious high society aspirations and Preston's fraudulent illusions. The grand ballroom, where my sister had brawled in a puddle of champagne and blood, was completely unrecognizable. I had repurposed the entire ground level into the official headquarters for my new philanthropic venture. The polished oak floors now supported rows of sleek modern workstations equipped with dual monitors and high-speed trading terminals. The antique marble fireplace where Marcus had faked his pathetic heart attack now served as the centerpiece of an elite collaborative workspace. I was not just keeping the brownstone as a private residence to hoard my wealth. I was transforming my grandmother's hard-earned legacy into a fortress of empowerment. I had officially launched a specialized foundation dedicated entirely to teaching advanced financial literacy, forensic accounting, and wealth management to young women of color. I wanted to arm the next generation of Black women with the exact same lethal financial knowledge that had allowed me to completely dismantle a multi-million-dollar fraud. I was going to teach them how to spot grifters, how to read shadow ledgers, and how to build impenetrable generational wealth, so they would never have to depend on the false promises of arrogant men or toxic families. A bright flash of white light temporarily blinded me, breaking my fierce concentration. I blinked away the spots and looked across the room. Desmond was standing near the grand foyer, meticulously adjusting the angle of a massive photography softbox. He was setting up the professional lighting equipment for the Foundation's official grand opening photo shoot scheduled for later this afternoon. Desmond stepped back from his camera tripod, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. I wore a simple black t-shirt and dark jeans, a stark, refreshing contrast to the flashy rented tuxedos and counterfeit designer suits my family used to worship. He did not need to project an illusion of wealth, because his value was grounded in actual talent and unshakable integrity. Desmond caught me watching him and offered a warm, genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He walked over to the cherrywood table, his presence bringing a quiet, grounding comfort to the massive room. He did not ask me for money. He did not ask me to diminish my own light so he could shine. Over the past month, our dynamic had naturally evolved far beyond a simple professional partnership. The intense high-stakes collaboration that began in his darkroom had blossomed into a profound mutual respect. We had dismantled a criminal empire together, and in the quiet aftermath, we had discovered a deep, effortless connection. He respected my relentless ambition, and I admired his sharp, observant nature. There were no power struggles and no toxic competitions. It was the first truly healthy romantic dynamic I had ever experienced in my entire life. Desmond leaned against the edge of the table, gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch was incredibly grounding. He looked around the pristine, high-tech workspace and told me that my grandmother would be unbelievably proud of what I had built. He said that turning a site of ultimate betrayal into a launching pad for young female scholars was the most brilliant payoff he had ever witnessed. I leaned into his touch, allowing myself to accept the genuine compliment without feeling the need to deflect or apologize. For my entire life, Vivian had conditioned me to believe that I was a bitter, loveless spinster who would only be valued if I was writing checks to cover my family's reckless mistakes. Standing here with a man who truly saw me, who celebrated my absolute strength, instead of fearing it completely shattered the last remaining fragments of my mother's cruel indoctrination. My phone vibrated violently against the wood of the table, disrupting the quiet intimacy of the moment. The device rattled incessantly, signaling a rapid barrage of incoming texts. I slowly picked it up and flipped the screen over. It was Kendra again. Her messages were escalating from pathetic begging to desperate emotional manipulation. She typed that blood was thicker than water. She claimed that we were sisters and that she would literally die if I did not wire her a few $100s right this second. She promised to pay me back as soon as her divorce was finalized, heavily implying that she was still waiting for some imaginary payout from a penniless federal inmate. Desmond glanced at the glowing screen, but he did not offer unsolicited advice. He simply stepped back, giving me the space and the absolute autonomy to handle my own demons. I looked at the pathetic, frantic words scrolling across my screen. The old version of me, the sister who had been trained to absorb every financial shock and clean up every catastrophic mess, might have felt a tiny sliver of misplaced guilt. The old Valerie might have wired the funds just to make the relentless buzzing stop. But that woman died the exact second I saw my forged signature on that fraudulent deed. I opened the digital keyboard on my phone. My fingers hovered over the glass screen with clinical precision. I did not feel angry or vindictive. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of finality. I typed out a single calculated response. Actions have interest rates. Yours just compounded. I stared at the blinking cursor at the end of the sentence. It was a flawless, cutting response. It was exactly the kind of sharp, devastating dialogue that would leave my sister utterly speechless. But as I looked at the words, I realized something incredibly profound. Hitting send meant acknowledging her existence. It meant giving her exactly what she was desperately craving, which was my attention and a sliver of my energy. Sending that message would keep the digital door cracked open, leaving room for her to argue, plead, or lash out. She did not deserve my brilliant wit, and she certainly did not deserve my time. I slowly highlighted the text I had just written. I pressed the delete key, erasing the sharp response completely. I backed out of the message thread and navigated directly to her contact profile. I scrolled down past her phone number and her email address. I firmly pressed the red block contact button. A confirmation prompt popped up on the screen, and I confirmed the action without a single heartbeat of hesitation. I locked the phone, tossing it casually back onto the table. I turned my full attention back to Desmond and the bright, beautiful future waiting for me under the studio lights. The studio lights powered down, casting long shadows across the oak floors of my foundation headquarters. We worked through the night setting up the financial literacy curriculum for our first cohort of young Black women. As the digital clocks rolled over to 5 in the morning, a profound stillness settled over the historic Washington brownstone. I left Desmond downstairs packing his camera equipment and walked up the grand mahogany staircase. My hand grazed the polished banister, tracing the path. My grandmother used to walk when she returned from a grueling 12-hour shift of scrubbing floors. She bled for this wood. She sacrificed her comfort to secure a fortress for her descendants. Vivian and Marcus had been eager to hand the keys to a white con artist to secure a Phantom Country Club membership. I viewed it as a sacred monument to Black resilience. I reached the second floor and walked straight down the hallway toward the master suite. This was the exact room where Kendra prepared for her fraudulent high society wedding. It was the room where my mother shoved that cheap polyester bridesmaid dress against my chest and commanded me to hide my face so my sister could shine. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped inside. The room was entirely transformed. The gaudy rented wedding furniture and the suffocating scent of Vivian's expensive perfume were completely gone. I stripped the suite down to its original historic bones, restoring the exposed brick and the beautiful bay windows. I unlatched the heavy brass locks on the French doors leading out to the private balcony. I pushed them open and stepped outside into the crisp, cool morning air. This was the very balcony where Desmond captured the high-definition photograph of Preston aggressively gripping the waist of Kendras' maid of honor. This was the exact spot where the original forged deed carelessly rested on a glass patio table, exposing a $2 million black market betrayal. Standing here now, I reclaimed the space completely. I walked to the edge of the wrought iron railing and rested my hands against the cool metal. The morning sun broke over the horizon, illuminating the iconic Washington skyline in brilliant streaks of gold and vibrant violet. I looked out over the historic streets and processed the magnitude of the journey I had completed. I did not just survive being the designated family scapegoat. I surgically dismantled the entire toxic ecosystem that tried to bury me alive. I took the very weapons they used to diminish me, my financial acumen, my quiet independence, and my refusal to perform for their validation, and turned those traits into impenetrable armor. Vivian and Marcus spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was a bitter, loveless spinster, only valued if I was writing checks to cover their catastrophic mistakes. Kendra built her fragile identity on the delusion that she was inherently superior, simply because she catered to our parents' status-obsessed expectations. They banded together to sacrifice my livelihood on the altar of Preston's counterfeit prestige. They failed because they severely underestimated the lethal precision of a woman who no longer sought their approval. I protected my grandmother's legacy from a shadow lending syndicate and a desperate grifter. More importantly, I protected my own peace. I drew a permanent, impenetrable boundary wrapped in federal eviction notices and executed with flawless legal strategy. The generational wealth my grandmother literally broke her back to build was now securely locked within a protective trust, immune to the reckless greed of the people who shared my bloodline but lacked my character. That wealth was going to educate and arm a new generation of fierce, financially literate Black women, ensuring they would never fall victim to predatory tactics or toxic enabling families. The sound of the French doors gently clicking open behind me pulled me from my reflections. I did not tense or put my guard up. I recognized the steady, deliberate rhythm of the footsteps stepping onto the balcony. Desmond walked up beside me, his presence radiating a quiet, grounding warmth I had never experienced in past relationships. He did not try to dominate the space or demand my attention. He simply stood beside me as an equal partner, witnessing the sunrise over the city we were going to conquer together. He reached out and handed me a fresh, steaming cup of premium dark roast coffee. The ceramic mug was warm against my palms, chasing away the lingering chill of the early morning air. I took a slow sip, letting the rich, bitter taste ground me perfectly in the present moment. I looked at Desmond, his dark eyes reflecting the golden light of the rising sun. There was no agenda in his gaze, no hidden motive, and no toxic expectation. There was only absolute respect and a budding, healthy romance built on unshakable trust. He smiled at me, a genuine, easy smile that reached the corners of his eyes. We spent the entire night building the foundation for my philanthropic empire, and we were just getting started. I turned my gaze back to the glowing skyline spreading out before us. The future was an unwritten blank ledger, waiting to be filled with investments that mattered and relationships that nourished my soul. I had severed the diseased branches of my family tree, and the roots were free to thrive. For the first time in my 34 years of existence, my world was entirely my own. I did not have to shrink myself to make anyone comfortable. I did not have to fund anyone's delusions. I leaned against the wrought iron railing, the warm coffee mug in my hands, and the man who truly saw my worth standing right by my side. A genuine, victorious smile spread across my face, reaching deep into my spirit. The morning sun washed over the historic brownstone, claiming the day as the screen faded to black on my absolute triumph. The greatest lesson here is that financial independence serves as your ultimate armor against a toxic family. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and shared genetics will never excuse financial abuse. When relatives reveal their true intentions through malicious actions, you must believe them immediately. You cannot heal in the exact same hostile environment that intentionally tried to break you. Real power comes from quietly building your own solid foundation and enforcing absolute boundaries. Never shrink yourself to make insecure people comfortable, because your worth requires no external validation. Have you ever cut off toxic relatives for peace? Subscribe for more.